Chapter 12. Memory's True Identity. Professor Hopper was floating in the air several steps away from them. We're here. The road that Ulrich and Xana were on was the color of rubies and crossed the sky of the first city like a large wind-blown scarf, without the need of columns or any support to hold it up. At a certain point, the road veered jarringly to the left, and it was only upon reaching the end of the turn that Ulrich noticed the presence of the castle that a moment earlier had been hidden by the blue skyscrapers that were sprung up all around like crystal fingers. The castle stood at the very center of the first city. It was a black building in the form of a hexagon, its upper levels finished off with ore and stone gargoyles. It had neither doors nor windows of any sort, as if the fortress had been carved out of a single block of stone. Ulrich clenched his teeth and jumped down from the road in the air. It was a 10-meter drop, but the young man landed on all fours without the slightest of harm. This was one of the advantages of the virtual world. Wow, he exclaimed. A short distance away, there was another golden ribbon road that rose above the ground and led to the castle, encircling it twice only to disappear somewhere over the horizon. Xana arrived beside Ulrich without even needing to jump, levitating gracefully over to the boy. He gestured to him, and they started to travel down the golden path together, approaching the imposing castle. Ulrich didn't think he had ever seen such an intense black before. It absorbed all the light around it, storing it in its opaque interior. Hopper materialized in front of him and pointed to a concrete point somewhere underneath him. "Look," he said. Corresponding to each peak of the hexagon, 6 rows of black bricks covered the ground of the city, forming 6 straight lines that became lost through the towers and streets, dividing them apart like architectural scissors. From above, the castle must seem like the black center of a giant star. "You must pay close attention, children," Hopper continued. "This castle is a weapon. I built it with the men in black, and neither Anthea nor I were able to do anything to prevent it." Ulrich realized that the professor wasn't really looking at them. His eyes bored into space. He remembered that this wasn't really Alita's father, only an extremely sophisticated computer program. "I wanted to deactivate the castle and render it harmless. I hoped that this way, the first city could transform into a gift for humanity instead of an instrument of destruction. Unfortunately, I committed an error. While I was fleeing from the men in black, I needed to reconstruct the city to be able to continue my research, but with it, I also needed to reconstruct the castle. This is when I understood that deactivating it wouldn't be possible." Hopper stopped and gave a sigh before continuing. "That is why I have decided to isolate it in a sandbox, forever enclosing the city in a place where it can cause no damage, and I built Lyoko. Lyoko was built as a barrier world capable of blocking the harmful effects of the castle while leaving intact its beneficial powers. But in order for my plan to be realized, I needed an ally, someone capable of controlling Lyoko and the first city. I needed a guardian." "A guardian?" whispered Ulrich. "Yes," said the young black-haired man opposite him with a smile. "Me." "The guardian," Hopper continued, "must be a very sophisticated artificial intelligence. I named him Xana, and to teach him to be human, I let he and my daughter, Alita, become friends." Odd yawned and rolled over. He tried to put his head under his pillow and count sheep, but nothing could be done about it, so he gave up and switched on the lamp on his nightstand. He looked at the alarm clock. It was barely 3 a.m. The young man couldn't stay calm. Too many thoughts kept rolling about in his mind like a caged tornado. After their return to the real world, the others got them up to date on the situation, and it was a real mess. All of their parents had been collaborators with Hopper. And Walter Stern. He was nothing but a traitor. Poor Ulrich. That must be difficult for his friend to take in. Another thing that kept him from sleeping was the memory of his father that he had found in the memory card, the video of Aelita's mother, kidnapped and gagged. Before heading to bed, Odd had talked with Jeremy a bit about it, but his friend was so exhausted that he might not have even heard him. And what's more, he had another thought, one that covered all the rest like a black veil. Eva Skinner. For the first time in his life, Odd felt ready to have a girlfriend and to dedicate himself solely to her. And then, what did he discover? That Eva wasn't a real person, but Xana, his enemy. Odd had fallen in love with a computer program, and an evil program to make things worse. "That's it!" he cried, and this time he pulled out his sheets with a kick and stood up. With Ulrich shut in the first city, his room felt empty and sad, and Odd needed to speak with someone, with a real friend. He reached for his phone and turned it on. Then he waited several seconds for the old device to get going and tried to call Jeremy. His phone was off. "Well, you won't escape me," he commented enthusiastically. "You're going to keep me company, even if I have to kick your door down. Even if I have to kick down your door." Odd let out a small laugh and put on a large jacket over his pajamas. It had already been several long minutes since he knocked on Jeremy's door, but his friend hadn't come to open it. He must be in a deep sleep. For a moment, Odd thought he'd leave him be. After all, it was late and Jeremy might need some sleep. Then his attention was caught by the doorknob. There was something strange about the lock. It was scratched, and the metal was bent towards the outside. Has someone broken in? The idea hadn't yet formally formed in his head, and so Odd was already turning the knob. He heard the lock protest with a quiet creak. He clenched his teeth and pushed the door with his shoulder. The lock suddenly gave way, causing the young man to fall flat on his face once in the room. Jeremy's room was pitch black. The light from the hall filtered inside, forming a bright triangle that spread across the floor all the way to his friend's empty and unmade bed. The sheets and covers were rolled up in a ball as if they had been shoved away with a kick. Where could Jeremy have gone at this time of night? And why were there those marks on the lock? He found the light switch on the wall and turned on the light, closing the door behind him. This was good old Jeremy's room, all right. Perfectly in order except for his desk, which was completely covered in computers and other machines. Hanging on the wall just above the bed was this poster of Einstein sticking his tongue out of the camera. And on the other side of the room was his closet. Odd approached the desk, but he didn't see anything strange. He turned around, then realized that there was a note tacked to the back of the door. The young man snatched it up immediately. The tack popped out and fell to the ground with a ting as Odd's eyes opened wide. It was a simple business card with a drawing of a strange bird and the words Green Phoenix printed on it in very historical typography. On the reverse side, someone had written in a very legible manner, "The friend is now with us." The Green Phoenix had kidnapped Jeremy. Jeremy was immobilized. The young man with the sharp face had broken into his room without making the slightest bit of noise and taken him without giving him time to react. A true professional. Jeremy then realized who he was facing. It was, without a shadow of a doubt, Grigory Nikopolis, the man with the dogs who had used the memory-snatching machine on Robert De La Robbie and the Ishiyamas. The young man had been taken out in 2 seconds. He smelled a strange odor climb into his nose, and he lost consciousness. Upon awakening, he found himself paralyzed. His arms were tied behind his back, and his legs bent behind him with his heels sticking into his back. He couldn't see anything either. Someone had taken away his glasses, and his head was in a black canvas bag that restricted his breathing. His head hurt. His mouth was sealed by something that tasted like plastic. Adhesive tape, he thought, and his ankles and wrists had been bound up tightly in such a way as to cause him a lot of pain each time he tried to move. Jeremy tried to remain calm. How much time had gone by since he was taken? Think, he said to himself. When Grigory arrived, he had just gone to sleep and he hadn't felt the need to drink or go to the bathroom, so it could only have been several hours maximum that he was unconscious. It was probably 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. Odd and the others wouldn't notice his absence until the following morning. He couldn't hope for an immediate rescue. Furthermore, how could they rescue him? Grigory was armed and dangerous, and his friends. "The kid's awake," came a catty, masculine voice. Jeremy felt a pair of hands grab him, and he tried to get away from them and cry out, but he wasn't able to. Someone slightly lifted the sack from his head, and a hand entered holding a tissue soaked with a substance that flooded his nostrils. Jeremy swallowed the spit. He shouldn't breathe it in. His struggle only lasted a few moments. Then he felt his head become heavier and heavier before he passed out again. Principal Dalmas's uncombed gray beard and his puffy eyes fit those of someone who had too little sleep. Professor Hertz also seemed exhausted. Odd shivered under his jacket. He was still wearing his pajamas underneath, and his bare feet were frozen. "What are you going to do?" he asked the adults. Immediately after having discovered the note, the young man went to fill in the professor, and then they went together to call the principal. They still hadn't informed Jeremy's father and the others. It was more important to trace out a good plan first. "We have to call the police," Dalmas spoke decisively. "Or better, Dido," Odd quickly contradicted him. Jeremy had told him everything that happened during the time he was in the mirror, as well as their alliance with the boss of the Men in Black. "Dido," said the principal, raising an eyebrow. "And just who is this Dido?" Spoke the professor while throwing a deadly look Odd's way. But the young man didn't let that intimidate him. Jeremy had been kidnapped. This wasn't a good time to worry about formalities. "Dido is a secret agent," he explained. "She manages a government agency." He tried to summarize the situation as best he could, remembering what Jeremy had told him. Hertz sighed with resignation and helped him to explain everything to the principal. At the end of the story, there was a long moment of silence. Delma sprung his hands together nervously, then gave an audible sigh. "Professor, is this all true?" "Yes," Hertz replied to him, holding his gaze. "Some of my students are involved in an international plot, and there is a supercomputer that is also a deadly weapon, and you are allied with a secret agency to fight against an army of terrorists." "Correct!" nodded I with enthusiasm. "And you haven't told me anything until they've now kidnapped one of the students?" I started to get the feeling that the principal wasn't totally happy with the situation, and he bit his lip. You shouldn't worry about it, Mr. Dalmas," he said, trying to smile. "Jeremy's a smart kid, and he can take care of himself. The same goes for Aelita and Ulrich and Eva. I know this all seems rather, desperate, but you'll see. We'll get through it." "Maybe," murmured Dalmas acceptingly. "At this point, it seems useless to me to call the police. Professor Hertz, call this Dido and ask her what we can do." In the meantime, I'll get in contact with the children's parents and tell them to come here immediately." Odd tried to think what Jeremy would say in his place. What ideas would he have? "That won't be enough, Mr. Delmas," he said, standing up. "You also need to think about the other students. Keddick is now in danger. You have to wake them all up and have them prepared to defend the school." The principal and the professor looked at him stupefied. Jeremy opened his eyelids. He was still tied up at the feet and hands, but he was no longer laid out on his stomach on the ground, but sat up on a wooden chair with armrests and a rotating seat. Someone had removed the adhesive tape over his mouth, and his head was no longer covered, although it didn't make a big difference considering that he was still without his glasses. The young man found himself in a very small room that smelled of dust and was largely occupied by a wide desk. It was so close to him that the edge of the table pushed into his knees, and a large metal filing cabinet that sat to his right. In front of him was a door, and to the left a window through which an icy breeze and fine blue light entered. It was surely almost daybreak. Even without being able to distinguish the details of the place, Jeremy quickly understood where he was, in the director's office in the old factory that was situated in the middle of the river. The same factory that housed the Lyoko supercomputer and which, for the time being, was being occupied by the soldiers of the Green Phoenix. He smiled. In a sense, Aelita and Ulrich were there, close to him, virtualized in the sandboxes of the supercomputer. He hoped that they would be okay and that they were doing well to keep out of Xana's clutches. "I need to get out of here," thought Jeremy, "and as quick as possible." He tried to move. Someone had placed his arms behind his back, and they were attached to his ankles with plastic cords or something of the sort. His feet were pressed against the pivoting base of the chair, but each movement that he made with them echoed to his wrists, causing him to painfully jolt. He clenched his teeth and tried to turn around using his back. The chair moved slightly. He continued in the opposite direction with more force and found his elbow pressed against the desk. Now he could bend his arm, and he could maybe manage to tilt the chair and cause it to fall to the ground. From there, with a bit of luck... The office door opened, and Jeremy stopped moving, slowly turning his head towards the person who came in and moved their hand about the wall looking for the light switch. After hearing the click, he had to shut his eyes as they had adjusted to the darkness. This unknown person closed the door behind her and approached him. They didn't give you back your glasses yet, did they? Here." It was a woman, and she had a friendly voice. Jeremy felt delicate fingers place the frame of his glasses correctly on his nose. The woman then sat on the desk several centimeters from him, with her legs crossed. She must be at least 50 years old. She was red-headed, and her face was clean, without any type of makeup. She was wearing jeans and a shirt, and a lab coat over top with a screwdriver sticking out of the pocket. "I'm Memory. What's your name?" "Jeremy," he replied, even though this wasn't much of a question. If they had kidnapped him, they had to know without a doubt who he was. "Don't be scared, Jeremy. Everything will be okay. We need you, but I'm sure that you'll help us, and afterwards you can go back to the school." "I don't have the slightest intention of helping a bunch of terrorists," Jeremy spat out, looking at her fixedly. "Please," Memory's voice seemed upset, "think before you act, and don't be careless. My boss, Hannibal Mago, well, let's just say that sometimes he can be somewhat impulsive." Hannibal Mago, the head of Green Phoenix. Suddenly Jeremy felt dizzy. "I came here," the woman continued, "to bring you to him and warn you that you need to be careful. I wouldn't want something to happen to you." She seemed sincere, but Jeremy's heart continued to race. Hannibal Mago, and he was on the verge of meeting him. Memory stood up and took out a utility knife from her coat. While she moved around, the neck of her shirt opened slightly, and Jeremy's eyes caught sight of something around the woman's neck. Memory was wearing a delicate golden chain, but it was the end of the necklace that caught the young boy's attention. It was round and as large as an old coin, and 2 letters were engraved on it, a W and an A, surrounded by a sailor's knot. Jeremy knew this necklace well, because Aelita had one exactly like it. Her father had left it for her before he disappeared, and Aelita's hair was a magnificent fire red color, just like Anthea's, her mother, just like Memory's.